Welcome to the Introduction to Genetics video lesson. In this lesson, we're going to do an introduction to Gregor Mendel, who's known as the father of genetics. We're going to discuss some basic genetic terminology that you need to know. We're going to discuss one of Mendel's Pea Plant Experiments, and then we're going to summarize Mendel's 4 laws. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Gregor Mendel is known as the father of genetics, and he was an Austrian monk who was a gardener in the monastery. He noticed and questioned various traits in pea plants and began experimenting via cross-pollination. More on that in a moment, on one example of his many experiments that he did with pea plants. But first, some basic genetic terminology. Our first term is genotype. Genotype is a pair of letters which tells what genes you received from your parents. We'll give an example of that here in a moment. Your phenotype is the physical appearance based on the genes you inherited from your parents. This is what the trait looks like. Next, the term homozygous. Homo means the same. Both genes are the same for a particular trait. And the options are either dominant homozygous, and here's a genotype, a pair of letters, which tells what genes you received from your parents. We're just going to use the letter A as an example. So a dominant homozygous, dominant is given the capital letter, whereas recessive is given a lowercase letter. A recessive trait is given a lowercase, and a dominant trait is given the uppercase of that same letter. So a homozygous dominant would be a genotype that is the same for a particular trait. So it has 2 A's. You got one A from your mom, and you got the other A from your dad. However, if you're homozygous recessive, that means you got one little a from your mom and you got one little a from your dad. This is as opposed to being heterozygous for a particular trait. Hetero means different. Both genes are different for a particular trait. Using that same example of the A, if you're heterozygous, that means you got a capital A from either your mom or dad and a little a from the other parent as well. Okay. Notice that heterozygous is dominant because the capital A, the capital letter, the dominant trait, always overrides the recessive trait. So if you have one of each, you're going to show the dominant trait. Your phenotype will be that you will show that trait will appear as what you look like dominant for that trait. So what is the only way that you can show the recessive trait? Is if you are homozygous recessive for that trait. Our last term on our basic genetic terminology is the term alleles. And alleles are the different forms of a particular gene. All right, next let's take a look at one of Mendel's pea plant experiments. Mendel looked at many traits in pea plants, including flower color and the color of seeds, whether the seeds were wrinkled or smooth. We're going to, for our example here, talk about the color of seeds. And what he figured out was that pea seeds that are green are the dominant color. So to be homozygous dominant means the pea seeds are capital G for green. There are also pea seeds that are yellow in color, and being yellow is the recessive trait. Because it's recessive in yields, gives way to the dominant trait, we use the same letter as the dominant trait, but we make it the lowercase. So we do not use Y's here, we use lowercase g's. And so homozygous recessive would be little g. In his parent generation, the P generation, which is the parental generation, he crossed plants with green seeds that were homozygous dominant with plants having yellow seeds, which were homozygous recessive. And what he found in his first offspring, and F stands for filial, or you could just use the term offspring. Offspring are the kids of the parent generation. He got 100% green seeds. They all showed the dominant trait. Green being the phenotype, and the genotype would be that you got one big G from one plant and the little g recessive trait from the other plant. And so combining those, your genotype would be heterozygous dominant, big G, little g. Well, dominant trait always overrides recessive trait, so they all showed the green color. The F2 offspring, the grandkids, would be the crossing the big G, little g plant with another big G, little g plant. And so the filial 2 generation, the kids then reproduced, and he got 75% green and 25% yellow seeds. And we'll show how to do this a little later, but 25% of them were homozygous dominant, 50% of them were heterozygous dominant, and 25% of them were homozygous recessive. So altogether, that means all these 25 and 50% here combined together are all green. So their 75% show the green phenotype, while 25% showed the yellow phenotype. This makes pea seed color a Mendelian trait. You'll often hear all this called Mendelian genetics. All right, let's summarize Mendel's 4 laws. We start off with the law of inheritance. The law of inheritance says that everyone has 2 genes for every trait. One came from mom, and the other came from dad. The next law is the law of dominance. The law of dominance says there are 2 forms for every gene. One is dominant, and you need only 1 copy of this to show the trait. And the other one is recessive, and as we discussed earlier, in order to show the recessive trait, you need 2 copies in order to show that trait. The next law is the law of segregation. The law of segregation says 2 genes in an individual separate when they make sex cells. Only one is passed on to the offspring. And his 4th law is the law of independent assortment. Every gene inherits by its own probability and does not influence what was inherited for other genes. So it's a random selection. Mendelian traits are ones which follow all 4 laws. Now let's take a look at a video in which Hank is going to show us these concepts that we just discussed as it applies to your earwax. Yep, that's right. That orangey pasty stuff that you pick out of your ear.